This is a very politically sensitive topic in Central Asia. So the Uyghurs issue, I think most people know about it already. And according to a lot of credible sources, so there are Uyghurs in these so-called re-education camps in China. And in fact, to be honest, there are also Central Asians like Kazakhs, Kyrgyz in these camps. So for the Central Asian locals, even this is political sensitive. Of course, they all feel emotionally very sad about this kind of development and maybe some kind of antagonism against such kind of policy. However, at the state level, so beyond the people, at the state level, Central Asian states tend not to talk about this kind of issue, but rather cooperate with the Chinese government to shut down any discussions or activism trying to investigate on such issue. So sometimes you see protests or some investigative journalists trying to report about these issues, and then they further are contacted by the Central Asian states to kind of censor them. So there is a tensions, and it creates a bit of instability in Central Asia in the sense, in general, the government wants to have a good cooperation, good relationship with the Chinese government. And people also want to have a good economic relationship with China. But this kind of very personal issues does hurt the feeling of the people. So there is always a friction inside these international relations between China and Central Asia. My interview was actually focusing on senior Chinese study experts and sinologists in these two countries, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It was not very easy to find really senior ones because some of them have passed away or some of them have retired, and it's not easy to reach them. But luckily, I managed to reach some of these scholars and done the interviews. And through the interview, in fact, what I wanted to understand is not just their perspective of the current relationship between China and Central Asia. I wanted to understand how they themselves as a scholar become interested in China and their intellectual journey and what has happened in the country and how that influenced them. And the key findings from my research is first very interesting is I think most of them have been highly influenced by Russian sinology, which used to be one of the best in the world. And some of them even went to Moscow to undergo training and then further become a scholar, a proper scholar, and then go back to their own country to develop their own Chinese study or sinology in their own country. So Russian sinology has a deep influence on them, meaning that there is a solid training for the older generations to have classical Chinese training, philology, historical training. And I can see that these older generations of scholars, I would call them what I call a sinological Chineseness. In a way, they are not Chinese, but they know so much about the Chinese language, the Chinese mindset, the history, culture, that make them actually a sort of a Chineseness. And I think deep inside their heart, not all of them, but some of them, because of their immersion in the Chinese culture, they are very fond of the people-to-people exchange, educational or academic exchanges with China. But at the political level, it gets a bit complicated because in Central Asia, it seems that those scholars, if their career wants to prosper, more or less they have to function and get the endorsement from the politics in order for them to find their way to establish a career. So most of them were started to do something that meets the needs of the state. For instance, many of them share that in the older days when their own independent country was just formed, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, there was border issue and diplomacy with the neighboring country like China. So their work was geared towards doing research about these kind of issues. And later, there was also a need for the Central Asian states to develop their own history because they didn't have a country before. So these scholars have to use their technique and their linguistic skill to understand what happened to their people centuries ago with Tang Dynasty, Han Dynasty, and how that can contribute to their construction of their own individual nation-state history. So they were asked to do this kind of job. And in more recent years, because of the Belt and Road Initiative by China and the idea of Central Asian country also to kind of propagate the Silk Road idea in order to attract funding from Chinese government. So these scholars, some of them were asked also to investigate how they can use this concept to further cooperate with China. This approach basically is trying to understand scholars' intellectual journey. And in a way, it's a bit critical reflection of ourselves, because we, as scientists, we tend to pretend, I think, that to show that we are neutral and scientific, as if we are not attached to the object that we are studying. But I think in reality, this is not true, particularly for those scholars in Central Asia and also actually scholars in Europe. Most of us bring our own personal reasons, personal motivations or passions, interests into the subject that we want to study. And that is, in this case, will be China and Central Asian scholars' interest in China. Most of them, those people I interview, they have told me that they were motivated to learn about China because there is a rising need of understanding China. And the need is actually the political need, like the newly independent states, and the states, they need to understand their neighbors and the relationship with the neighbor. So those scholars, looking back on their development, they need this kind of endorsement from the government. They need to work for the government and meet the needs of the government in order to produce their academic projects and then move on in their academic career. So it's very interesting to do this kind of epistemological comparison. And then, you see that politics is driving a lot in the way they study about China. But when I ask them about the contemporary relations that you are asking about, politics, economic, culturally, or educationally, I would say those scholars do not always have the same view. Politically, I think they are all very careful, try not to be seen as being critical of the government. This is very unique of a Central Asian scholars. So in a way, they try not to touch upon it. I can maybe sense a bit of cautiousness of these Chinese scholars when they try to answer my questions. But in a way, they don't want to be seen as objecting the government's eagerness to approach China and have cooperation with China. Economically, even so, because Central Asian states, they really need to have an economic relation with China in order for them to modernize. Educationally wise, because those scholars, they were Chinese study experts. So in a way, they see the importance of having their younger generations going to China, learning Chinese and having educational exchanges. So in a way, they all welcome that. But I think there's a division among the experts regarding whether there's a need to educate the younger generation to learn Chinese language or not. Some people say, yes, of course, it's important. But then I also heard some experts told me, well, wait, what we need from China is not learning Chinese language. You could have a very basic level of Chinese language and do some business with them. But what we really need in order to modernize our Central Asian state is actually those technologies that China has. So IT technology, for instance. So we don't want to waste our time to let our kids learn Chinese. There's a division of views here, but I guess all of these views are well taken. And one criticism is also in the current, I think in our modern educational system, those senior scholars, they criticize. Usually, students get to learn Chinese language maybe in 2 to 3 years' time, which is not sufficient for you to cultivate a real sinologist or real Chinese experts. So because of this trend, I guess that's why they tend to see, well, let's just look at the practical need. We need to do business and have engagement with China. So a bit of language training and plus other knowledge is necessary. Thank you.